Western Pennsylvania. A tax collector approaches a farmhouse door. He never makes it inside. That year, the federal government of the United States had taxed whiskey, and the men who made it decided they would rather fight. They had already tarred and feathered collectors, burned buildings, sent threatening letters signed in blood. Now, as armed militias massed in the hills, President Washington made a decision that shocked the young republic. He would send an army of 13,000 men to enforce a liquor tax. Think about that. The nation that had fought a revolution over unjust taxation had now become the taxer. The farmers who had been patriots were now insurgents. And whiskey, a clear spirit made from grain, had become the fault line between federal authority and the American frontier. It would not be the last time whiskey shaped the fate of a country. Not even close. But to understand what made this drink dangerous enough to start an insurrection, we need to go back. Because the story of whiskey does not begin with American farmers. It begins much earlier in the monasteries of medieval Europe and further still in the ancient question of what to do with grain when it rots. We think of whiskey as a drink, a reward at the end of a long day, something amber in a glass, something warm in the throat, a thing of comfort, of celebration, of quiet evenings. That is what the marketing tells you. That is what the bottle wants you to believe. But whiskey is something else entirely. It is a technology that emerged from alchemy, a currency that built the American frontier, a weapon that colonial powers used to hollow out entire civilizations, a contraband that gave birth to organized crime. And today, it is a geopolitical instrument. A multi-billion-dollar export that governments use as soft power across trade negotiations and diplomatic tables. The glass is ordinary. The history inside it is not. Whiskey has been at the center of wars, revolutions, famines, and empires. It has financed governments and destroyed communities. It has been medicine, sacrament, and poison, sometimes all three at once. This is the story of how a fermented grain became one of the most consequential substances in human history. And it starts, as so many world-altering things do, with someone trying to solve a much simpler problem. For most of human history, grain was everything. It was food, of course. But it was also wealth, storage, power. A civilization's ability to survive winter came down to how much grain it had put away in the warm months. And so for thousands of years, across Mesopotamia, across the early agricultural societies of the Fertile Crescent, the central obsession of settled human life was grain. How to grow it, how to store it, and crucially, what to do when it began to spoil. Because grain spoils. It gets wet. It ferments. And somewhere in the ancient world, historians trace it to Mesopotamia, around 4000 BC, though the evidence is fragmentary. Someone realized that fermented grain, rather than being a disaster, was something else. Something that loosened the muscles after labor. Something that quieted fear. Something that made the darkness a little less dark. These early fermented grain drinks were not whiskey. They were closer to a thick, murky beer, unfiltered, consumed through reeds, shared in ceremonial and communal settings. But they were the first step. The biological intuition that grain, water, and time could produce something more than food. The leap from fermented grain to distilled spirit would take thousands more years. And it would require a science that the ancient world did not yet have. That science came from an unlikely direction. Between the 8th and 11th centuries, say, Arab alchemists, scholars working in the intellectual tradition of the Islamic Golden Age, were experimenting with a process called al-tata. the careful application of heat to a liquid to separate its components by evaporation and condensation. They were not making whiskey. They were making perfumes, medicines, studying the nature of matter itself. But the technology they refined, distillation, would prove to be one of the most transformative techniques in human history. That knowledge traveled along trade routes through Moorish Spain into the monasteries of medieval Europe, where monks received it and immediately understood its potential. Not for pleasure, not officially at least, but for medicine. In Ireland and Scotland, by the 11th and 12th centuries, monastic distillers were producing what they called, in Gaelic, Ish Beata, the water of life. A distilled grain spirit used to treat ailments, preserve herbal medicines, and, in the cold, wet, windswept northern Atlantic world, simply keep the body functioning. The word isi would eventually, through centuries of anglicization, become something much simpler. Whiskey. The name was practical, the substance was transformative, and the monks who first distilled it in their stone cellars had no idea what they had set in motion. Because what they had made was not just a medicine. They had made the first version of something that could be stored for years, transported across continents, and concentrated into small enough volumes to carry on a ship. They had made a commodity. And commodities in the hands of the right people become something else entirely. They become power. The copper pot still is a deceptively simple object. At its most basic, it is a vessel, a tube, and a coil. You heat a fermented liquid in the vessel. The alcohol, which boils at a lower temperature than water, rises first. It travels through the tube, it cools through the coil, it condenses. And what drips out the other end is something fundamentally different from what went in. Concentrated, clarified, preserved, this process, adopted from Arab alchemical science and adapted by European distillers through the 13th and 14th centuries, changed whiskey from a monastic curiosity into an economic force. Before the still, you could make ale or beer, but ale spoiled quickly. It was heavy, watery, impossible to transport in meaningful quantities. After the still, you could take a field of barley, a source of water, some time and heat, and produce something that would last for years, that traveled in manageable barrels. That contained more value per unit of weight than almost any other agricultural product. That is not a small thing. In a pre-industrial world where transportation was slow, spoilage was constant, and trade depended on durable goods, distilled spirits were extraordinary. They were agricultural surplus, made permanent. In Scotland and Ireland, where the land was often too rocky and wet for reliable grain surpluses, the still became a survival technology. A bad harvest meant hunger. But if you could convert even a modest grain supply into whiskey, a product that wouldn't rot, that could be traded, that could serve as currency when metal coin was scarce, you had a buffer against catastrophe. By the 15th century, records show whiskey being produced at scale in both Ireland and Scotland. In 1494, the Scottish Exchequer rolls contain what is widely considered the first written record of Scotch whisky production, an order of malt to Friar John Core by command of the king to make aqua vitae. 8 bowls of malt. Enough, by modern estimates, to produce nearly 500 bottles. That entry is significant for what it reveals. The king already knew about the product. He was already ordering it made. The state had already noticed that this substance existed, and where states notice substances, taxation and control are never far behind. But before the state could fully tighten its grip, something happened that sent whiskey far beyond the hills of Scotland and Ireland, something that transformed a regional agricultural practice into a global commodity. The people who made it were forced to leave. The Highland clearances of the 17th and 18th centuries, a brutal campaign by Scottish landlords enabled by British policy that drove tens of thousands of people off their ancestral lands, scattered Scots-Irish distillers across the Atlantic world. They brought their skills, their copper stills, and their grain knowledge with them to a new continent. And on the American frontier, they found exactly the conditions that whiskey had always thrived in. Abundant grain, scarce currency, and a government that was very far away. That distance would not last. And when it closed, the result would be an army, a rebellion, and a confrontation that would define what the new American Republic actually meant. But first, whiskey had an empire to help build. By the 17th century, whiskey had outgrown its origins. It was no longer just a Scottish or Irish drink. It was moving, following the ships, following the soldiers, following the dispossessed and the ambitious across the Atlantic. And as it moved, it entangled itself with the largest economic systems of the age. Systems built on extraction, on trade, on the forced movement of human beings. To understand whiskey's role in empire, you have to understand the triangle. The Atlantic trade system that powered the British Empire in the 17th and 18th centuries was built on 3 points. Manufactured goods flowed from Britain to Africa. Enslaved Africans were transported to the Americas, and American commodities, sugar, tobacco, cotton, and grain, flowed back to Britain. Alcohol was present at every point of that triangle. Rum, made from West Indian molasses, was perhaps the dominant spirit. But whiskey ran alongside it, serving as currency on the frontier, as ration on naval ships, as lubricant for the entire machine. In North America, the Scots-Irish settlers who pushed into the Appalachian interior brought their distilling knowledge and found something waiting for them. Corn. Indigenous to the Americas, corn was abundant, it fermented well, and it could be grown in the rocky, difficult soils of the frontier where barley and wheat struggled. The result, a corn-based whiskey aged in charred oak barrels, would eventually become bourbon. Named, most likely, after Bourbon County, Kentucky, where it was widely produced. But bourbon's origins are also a story of displacement. The land where those Scots-Irish farmers built their stills had, within living memory, been home to Cherokee, Shawnee, and other indigenous nations. The whiskey economy that flourished on the frontier was inseparable from the dispossession that made the frontier possible. And whiskey was not a neutral bystander in that dispossession. Colonial traders had long understood that alcohol was a powerful tool in unequal negotiations. By the 18th century, the deliberate flooding of indigenous communities with alcohol as a means of extracting land, furs, and labor was widespread enough that many indigenous leaders specifically cited it as a weapon of colonial control. Traders knew what they were doing. The records where they survive are not ambiguous. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, Scotch whiskey was becoming something different, a marker of British imperial identity. As the empire expanded through the 19th century, Scotch travelled with it into the officers' messes of India, into the trading houses of Hong Kong, into the settler colonies of Australia and Canada. It was the drink of a certain kind of Englishman, or someone who wanted to be seen as one. It carried status. It carried civilization in the colonial understanding of that word. By the mid-19th century, whiskey was not just one commodity among many. It was stitched into the fabric of Atlantic empire, present in its celebrations and its cruelties, its frontier violence and its drawing room diplomacy. A farm product had become a political instrument, and the people who actually made it were about to pay the price. The history of whiskey is, in large part, a history of who bears the costs so that someone else can bear the profit. Begin with the most fundamental hidden system, the labor that grew the grain. On the American frontier, that labor was often the farmer himself, struggling, indebted, isolated, but as whiskey production industrialized in the 19th century, particularly in Kentucky and Tennessee, it became inseparable from enslaved labor. Enslaved people cleared the land, grew the corn, hauled the water, tended the fires under the stills, and rolled the barrels to market. The master distillers, whose names appear on historical records and, in some cases, on bottles sold today, they often owned the people doing the actual work. This is not a peripheral footnote. By some accounts, the majority of whiskey produced in the antebellum American South was produced using enslaved labor. The bourbon industry is still working through the implications of that history, slowly, and not without resistance. There is also the story of what whiskey did to the communities it passed through on its way to market. For indigenous nations across North America, the consequences were catastrophic. Most historians point to a combination of factors: dispossession, cultural destruction, epidemic disease, but the deliberate introduction of alcohol into communities that had no cultural or physiological preparation for it was, by many accounts, a calculated instrument of control. Traders offered alcohol in exchange for furs and land. Colonial governments alternately banned and permitted the trade depending on political convenience. The result was addiction, dependency, and the erosion of social structures that had sustained those communities for generations. This is not a story about weakness. It is a story about power. Specifically, about what happens when one group controls a substance and deliberately targets another group with it. Then there is the class violence embedded in the Whiskey Rebellion itself, which is where this story began. The 1794 uprising in western Pennsylvania was not simply a tax protest. It was, at its core, a class conflict. The whiskey tax imposed by Alexander Hamilton's treasury fell disproportionately on small frontier distillers. Farmers who operated single stills to convert their grain into a tradable commodity, while large commercial distillers in the East received more favorable rates. The people who had the least were being asked to subsidize a federal government that served, many of them believed, the interests of the wealthy. Washington's army ended the rebellion without major bloodshed. But the underlying tensions between federal power and frontier autonomy, between the wealthy and the dispossessed, did not dissolve. They went underground. They became part of the mythology of American individualism. And that mythology, forged in part around a whiskey tax, still shapes American political identity today. The drink had moved from monastery to frontier to empire to open conflict. And now, it was about to face something it had never encountered before. A movement determined to destroy it entirely. This is the kind of story we dig into every week on this channel. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. On January 17, 1920, the United States shut off the taps. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified the previous year after decades of pressure from the temperance movement, made the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors illegal across the entire country. It was, by any measure, one of the most ambitious acts of social engineering in modern democratic history. A nation of 106 million people, with a whiskey industry that had been running continuously for over a century, was told, stop. The government believed it would work. It did not work. What Prohibition actually did was not eliminate whiskey. It eliminated legal whiskey. The demand did not disappear, it went underground, and in going underground, it created something the temperance advocates had not anticipated, an entirely new criminal economy, capitalized by alcohol money and protected by violence. The names that emerged from that economy are now cultural mythology. Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, the bootleggers who ran convoys of illicit whiskey down rural roads at night, who bribed police chiefs and judges and city aldermen, who turned the speakeasy into an institution. By some estimates, illegal alcohol was $1 billion industry within the first years of Prohibition in 1920s money. The organized crime syndicates that formed to manage that industry did not dissolve when Prohibition ended in 1933. They diversified. They survived. The infrastructure of American organized crime, its corruption networks, its distribution systems, its capacity for violence was built in significant part on whiskey money. But Prohibition's legacy runs deeper than gangsters. When the 18th Amendment was repealed by the 21st in 1933, the whiskey industry did not simply resume where it had left off. 13 years of illegality had destroyed most small and mid-sized distilleries. The equipment was gone. The knowledge was scattered. The supply chains had collapsed. What filled the vacuum were large, well-capitalized corporations, companies with the resources to rebuild quickly and the political connections to secure the new licensing regimes. In other words, Prohibition, a movement designed to destroy the whiskey industry, ended up consolidating it. The small farmer distiller who had been the backbone of American whiskey since the frontier era was effectively finished. What replaced him was a corporate model, standardized production, national distribution, brand identity over craft. The bottle you pick up in a liquor store today, the one with the heritage label and the cursive script and the story about a family recipe from 1870, is, in most cases, the product of a corporate system that was born directly from the wreckage of Prohibition. The movement that tried to kill whiskey gave it a new and more powerful form. And that form, it turned out, was perfectly designed for the world that was coming. Whiskey today is a $100 billion industry. Let that number sit for a moment. $100 billion. Generated annually by a product whose essential process, ferment grain, distill it, age it in wood, has not fundamentally changed since a medieval monk first coaxed spirit from a copper vessel in a stone cellar. The technology scaled, the geography spread, but the chemistry is, at its core, the same. What changed is everything around the chemistry. Scotch whisky is now one of the United Kingdom's most significant exports, worth billions of pounds annually and present in more than 180 countries. When the UK negotiates trade deals, Scotch is often explicitly on the table. When tariffs are imposed, as the United States did during a trade dispute in 2019 and 2020, placing a 25% levy on single malt Scotch, Scottish distillers feel it within months. A drink made in the Highlands of Scotland becomes an instrument of leverage in Washington trade negotiations. The local and the geopolitical are, in whiskey, inseparable. Bourbon, meanwhile, has become a form of American soft power. The US government has designated bourbon a distinctive product of the United States, meaning it can only be called bourbon if it is made in America, from a grain mixture of at least 51% corn, aged in new charred oak containers. When foreign governments place retaliatory tariffs on American goods, bourbon is frequently among the first targets. Precisely because it is so legible as an American symbol. The European Union, Canada, and Mexico have all, at various points, targeted bourbon in trade disputes. A Kentucky distillery's export numbers become a barometer of diplomatic relations. Then there is Japan. Japanese whiskey, built on techniques learned directly from Scottish distillers in the early 20th century, particularly through a man named Masataka Taketsuru, who studied distillation in Scotland and brought the knowledge home, has become, over the past 2 decades, among the most sought-after and expensive whiskey in the world. Bottles of Yamazaki and Hibiki sell at auction for tens of thousands of dollars. Japan took a foreign technology, refined it with extraordinary precision, and produced something the originators had not imagined. It is one of the stranger arcs in the story of global trade. Scotland teaches Japan to make whiskey, and a century later, Japanese whiskey commands prices that Scottish distillers can only observe with a complicated mixture of admiration and alarm. The craft distillery movement, which exploded across the United States, the UK, Australia, and beyond after roughly 2010, represents something else again. It is, in part, a genuine revival of small-scale production and regional grain varieties. But it is also a marketing phenomenon, a consumer desire for authenticity, for story, for the feeling of connection to something pre-industrial and human-scaled, in a world that is increasingly neither. The small distillery with its hand-lettered labels and its single farmer supplier is selling, above all, an idea. The idea that whiskey can still be what it once was: local, personal, made by hand. Whether that idea is true is a more complicated question. Many craft distilleries source their base spirit from large industrial producers and finish it locally. The line between genuine craft and artisanal branding is, in the whiskey world, often blurry. But the desire behind it is real, a hunger for exactly the kind of human-scale story that industrial consolidation erased. Which brings us to the supply chain that most drinkers never think about. The oak barrel is not incidental to whiskey. It is, legally and chemically, essential. American bourbon must be aged in new charred oak. Scotch is typically aged in used bourbon barrels or sherry casks. The global whiskey industry runs on oak, and oak takes decades to grow. The barrel supply chain is long, slow, and increasingly strained. Climate change is altering the forests where cooperage oak is harvested. A disruption to the timber supply in the American Midwest can be felt years later in the flavor profile and price of a bottle of Scotch. The tree and the drink are bound together in a timeline that has nothing to do with quarterly earnings reports. This is the hidden system behind every bottle. Not just the grain and the water and the copper and the fire, but the forest, the climate, the trade agreement, the tariff schedule, the diplomatic relationship, and the century of decisions that made this particular drink in this particular form available to you right now. It did not happen by accident, and it did not happen without cost. There is a moment when you hold a glass of whiskey up to the light where you can see straight through it. The liquid is amber, translucent, almost luminous. It looks simple. It looks like exactly what it is: fermented grain, distilled, aged, poured. But you know now that it is not simple. In that glass is the memory of a medieval monk in a stone cellar, coaxing alcohol from barley because the winter was long and the medicine cabinet was bare. It carries the ambition of a Scottish farmer who converted his grain to spirit because spirit could be traded when coin could not. The grief of a Scots-Irish family loaded onto a ship during the clearances, carrying their copper still because it was the only wealth they had left. It carries the violence too, the enslaved hands that tended the fires in Kentucky distilleries, the indigenous communities targeted with alcohol as a tool of dispossession. The tax collector who approached a farmhouse door in 1794, and the 13,000 soldiers who marched to back him up. The bootlegger's car on a dark road in 1923, running from federal agents carrying a cargo that was simultaneously illegal and universally desired. It carries Prohibition's strange unintended gift, the corporate consolidation that killed the small distiller and built the global brand. The trade negotiators who put scotch on the table alongside steel and semiconductors. The Japanese master who traveled to Scotland a century ago and came home with knowledge that his country would eventually perfect. Whiskey is not a footnote to history. It is one of its recurring subjects, showing up wherever grain and human ambition intersect, wherever there is surplus to convert and power to consolidate and profit to extract. It has been medicine and poison, currency and contraband, sacrament and weapon. The glass is ordinary. The history is not. And the next time you pour one, or walk past a bottle on a shelf, you might find that you cannot quite look at it the same way you did before. Because now you know what it cost to get there. And you know that the story is not over. The barrel is still aging. The trade dispute is still unresolved. The forest is still growing, or in some places it is not. The water of life runs on. That's the hidden history of whiskey. If you want more stories like it, subscribe and drop a comment with the topic you think deserves the same treatment next. And if you're wondering which everyday object has a darker, stranger history than whiskey, you might be surprised. The answer is sitting closer than you think.